Hi, welcome to my latest video. Today I have broken down. I've broken down on the A30 in Basingstoke. I've called green flag. They're on their way. But in the meantime, they're going to be about half an hour. So in the meantime, I'm going to see if I can get my car running again. It just kind of spluttered to a halt. It kind of hiccuped as if there was a crank sensor issue, and then it cut out and ended up coming up with reduced engine performance, and I managed to pull across onto the end of this slip road here just to get to a safe position, put my hazards on and my amber strobes. I've tried disconnecting the battery, that didn't seem to help. I'll just show you what's going on. Right, let's get this. So, oh, it started again. Amazing. That's a bit strange. Okay, not sure what to do now. Okay, I shall let it sit and idle for a bit. Might even just wait for the guy who's coming out. Just leave this running. I tried disconnecting the battery, and that didn't seem to help. It was just cranking and not actually starting, and not actually firing up. So, yeah, very strange. Wonder if it's a fueling issue. It's a sort of crank sensor fueling type of issue. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll let this run for a bit just in case it dies again. I read the codes with my little code reader, and there were no codes at all. Nothing at all. So, not sure really. Okay, I shall stop filming now, and I'll give you an update later on. Okay, so I managed to get home. It was only about 3 miles down the road. It did cough a couple of times on the way back, in particular when I had my foot down trying to accelerate. So my money is on the crank sensor. The crank sensor is in here somewhere at the bottom of the engine. It's sort of next to the crank pulley. So I will change that sensor. I've actually got a spare sensor which I bought ages ago. It's in my glove box and I've never fitted it. I'll change that over and see if it cures the problem. Before I do that, I'm going to take my car up the road to my local garage and get them to plug in a better diagnostics piece of equipment and just see if they can find any faults or any error codes. My cheap eBay code reader just wouldn't find anything at all. So yeah, still a little bit of a mystery. But my money is on the crank sensor. I have had issues before with the crank sensor when I've been through deep water. Water has got into the wiring and the connection on the crank sensor, and it's caused the car to hiccup and splutter and lurch, in particular under acceleration. Really, you only tend to notice it when you're actually pushing the car to accelerate. So this was exactly the same. It coughed a couple of times and then the engine just cut and it said reduced engine performance, and that was it. I was at the side of the road and it wouldn't restart, and eventually it did. So I went to the local garage earlier, and the mechanic there connected a much more advanced diagnostics tool than my cheap eBay one here. And his diagnostics machine did show some historic error codes for crank position sensor, which is in there, and also throttle body position, which is here. Now, the throttle body was removed from the car and refitted about 2 weeks ago, so there is a possibility that I have disturbed the connections on that. I was very careful to reconnect everything carefully and properly and make sure that the connectors clicked on, but I will just have a look and just make sure that nothing's become disconnected there. This is my diagnostics tool that I used earlier at the side of the road. This is a little cheap eBay one, and it said there were no errors and no codes, and yet when I went to the garage, there were a whole load of codes, but unfortunately they didn't seem to have a date and time next to them. It was just a list of errors that had occurred at some point since the errors were last cleared. Okay, so I did clear error codes using this tool a few weeks ago when I was doing my intercooler hoses. I had turbo underboost error and I cleared the code. So the errors that the mechanic saw on his diagnostics tool at the garage have occurred in the last few weeks, possibly even today. Okay, so what I'm going to do first, I'm mindful of changing several things at once. So I'm going to change this, this is a brand new crank position sensor. Okay, so the sensor itself is what's called a Hall effect sensor. It's a little magnetic sensor. There's no moving parts inside it. It just detects the magnetic flux change as the sort of crank pulley turns. It's got a toothed wheel on it, and that sort of the teeth go close to this, and it just detects the peak, the sort of the square wave, the sort of ones and noughts of the square teeth on the wheel as they go past. And then there is one tooth missing, which is the actual RPM measurement. So that actually rotates once per rotation of the engine, and the teeth on the gear give the computer an indication of the engine speed. Okay, so not only does it say the position of the crankshaft, but also the engine speed. There is also a camshaft sensor. This is a camshaft sensor here, which goes somewhere. I think it's up here somewhere on the end of the cam. It might be the other end, I don't know. But that's also a candidate for causing this kind of issue. I'll hold off on changing that for now until I've changed this one, hoping that changing that will cure the problem and the car will run fine again. So we'll see. If that doesn't sort it, then there's this one. And another candidate as well is the fuel filter, which is in here. That fuel filter was changed at about 75,000 miles, 80,000 miles, and the car is now on 155,000, so it is really due another change of the fuel filter. The issue that I had earlier was a sort of lurching, coughing kind of, the engine was cutting in and out. It was sort of like a sort of a fuel starvation type of issue. I would actually say it was more like the crank position sensor, because this is quite a violent jolt that you get through the car when it sort of the power is taken completely off and then put back on, and the car jolts. With a fueling issue, the car tends to sort of splutter a bit and just have a bit of a wobbly power output. It doesn't tend to lurch on and off violently like it did earlier. Okay, so this is why I'm focusing on this first. Once I've looked at sensors and cleaned up all the other plugs and that, if the issue's still occurring, then I will change the fuel filter, but it would be more of a sort of preventative maintenance change. I don't think this issue was caused by the fuel filter being blocked. If the fuel filter is blocked, then the car can be very difficult to start normally. It cranks over many times before the fuel kind of comes through. I'm not really seeing that. I mean, the issue at the side of the road earlier is it was cranking the engine, and it was just not even attempting to fire up. There was no sort of coughing and chugging. It just was turning the starter motor or cranking the engine with nothing at all, which to me says that the crank position sensor couldn't see the engine turning, and the injectors were not injecting fuel. If it was a fuel filter issue, then the injectors would be firing, everything would be trying to work normally, but you'd end up with poor fuel delivery or air bubbles or something in the fuel lines, and the engine will kind of cough and splutter and half run and half start. I wasn't seeing that. Mine was just dead, absolutely dead, would not start, would not fire, and then suddenly fired up absolutely fine as if nothing had gone wrong. So as a general rule, if the engine is cutting out violently, so it's either running or not, on or off, it's electrical, like a sensor. If the engine is running rough and spluttering and coughing and having sort of just general poor performance and poor sort of stability on the revs, then it's usually a fuel issue. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this video is jack up the front of the car, take this wheel off, remove the inner wheel arch liner and get access to the crank position sensor and change that over, and then go for a drive and just see if it's any better. Hopefully that's all that we need to do to sort this problem. Right, so I've got the wheel off, jacked the car up with an axle stand underneath the car there. Let's see if we can see this crank sensor. It is this thing here. So this is the crank pulley, which turns with the crankshaft and the engine, and that is the sensor with its wiring. And as you can see, it's all pretty muddy here. It is in a bad place there because it does get sprayed by mud and water, and it is a common problem, especially on these Freelander 2s. Really, you go through deep water, that sensor gets submerged, and if the connector's not completely watertight, then water gets in, and the classic symptoms will be the car lurching, especially under acceleration. So you go to pull away and the car lurches and coughs, and the power disappears and then comes back on again. Okay, very similar to what I had earlier. So what I'm going to do is remove this panel here. Don't need to take the full wheel arch liner out. It's just these couple of nuts here, and then possibly a screw or two at the bottom there, and then that inspection panel kind of comes out, and that will allow us to get in to the sensor. So I'll remove that now, and then we'll have a closer look. So these nuts here are a 10mm socket. These are not the factory nuts. The factory nuts are actually made out of plastic, and they have a habit of just spinning and not actually undoing. So I've replaced mine by stainless steel nylock nuts, which work a lot better. They don't rust, and they actually turn and undo properly when you want them to. Okay, I've removed that panel now. That's over there. Okay, so I've removed 2 of the 3 screws that are holding my splash guard, bib or spat as they're known, on the front here. These don't do a lot really to protect or to prevent spray from coming up, but I only fitted them because I think they look good. So I've taken out 2 of the 3 screws. That allows this panel to come out once these 2 10mm nuts are removed. And now we can actually have a look in here and see what we've got. So air conditioning compressor here, this outer part of the pulley always rotates with the engine and with the belt, but the inner part is on a sort of electromagnetic clutch, so the actual compressor inside here only spins when the air conditioning is turned on. Okay, so that's controlled electronically. So sometimes you'll look and you'll just see the outer bit of the pulley turning, and this inner bit is not turning. What else have we got here? Idler pulley, tensioner pulley. I've done another video on how to change the tensioner pulley. If your idler pulley fails, like mine did not so long ago, then you're better off changing the tensioner as well as the idler, and if you're changing the tensioner, why not take the opportunity to change the idler? I changed my tensioner, and then a few months later my idler failed, so I ended up having to fit another tensioner pulley, because the tensioner pulley comes with a locking pin that allows you to get the belt into position, and then you carefully take up the slack and pull out the pin and release the tension, and it then sort of tensionizes the belt. Then you release you take up the pressure slightly with a socket, pull out the pin, and then release the pulley against the spring, and that then tensions up the belt. It's a lot easier doing it that way than trying to sort of fit a new belt with a tensioner still pressing against it. The crank pulley is here, so this is the pulley on the end of the crankshaft on the bottom of the engine, and this is the sensor that we're trying to get to. So here is our new sensor, so you can see that then sits sort of like that. You've got this connector here, there's one bolt locating it. This hole here is just a hole, some sort of locating peg, maybe it stops it moving around, but it is only one bolt. As you can see, this connector here is pretty muddy. The spray guard that goes here is more to protect the belt than the sensor. The sensor is still quite exposed, and when you go through a puddle or go through deep water or mud, I mean, that sensor's just going to get soaked. Okay, so you can see here, you can actually see the wires coming out of the connector here. There's no sort of strain relief or rubber protective cover over that. I mean, I reckon actually if I stuck a couple of pins down in there and got a meter out, I could actually probably get some electrical voltage down those holes there. So if I could do that, then water can easily get in. It's no wonder I've got problems, really. So one project that I'm thinking of doing in the future is some kind of spray guard that kind of bolts here and just gives that sensor and the connector and the wiring a bit of protection against splashes of water. Okay, so I'll add that to my list of future projects. Really, it's not a high priority at the moment, really, but if I get time at some point, I'll develop something. But for now, I need to remove that old sensor, so I need to unplug it and remove the sensor and fit the new one. Okay, so I've loosened off that bolt there, 10mm socket. I can't quite figure out how to disconnect this connector, so what I'm going to do is take this bolt out and actually lift the sensor out. Come on, lift the sensor out with the wire still attached, so that I can just get a better view of. How does that come out? There we go. Literally just pulls off. What I wanted was to just get a better view of this. You see here, there's a sort of barb thing, one of these crazy connectors where you have to, I don't know, lift that probably. There we go. Yep, so you lift that. Some of them you press, some connectors on this car you press, some you lift, some you have to slide something. And there it is. Now, I don't know if that has just come off my glove, or whether or not that mud was already in there. Looking at that, okay, so I haven't poked my gloves down into that hole. The pins look pretty shiny, but there's definitely mud or muddy water residue down in there. You can't really see it very well on the camera here, but just down the sides. So it looks as if water has actually been getting past this blue seal, so that there's actually a bit of, I don't know if you can see that, I'm going to try and zoom in. There's a bit of grass there, right, which was kind of like trapped on the seal. And the sort of mating face here is like a bit dirty and The seal just looks a bit dirty. So I think water has been getting in there, and even if it didn't go down there, I reckon it's been getting in here. So I'll give it all a real good WD-40ing before putting all that back together. Nothing I can really do about those wires. Maybe put some sealant or something in those holes. Yeah, that might be a good idea. Okay. Okay, so there's the new sensor in. Judging by the fact that it's the actual magnetic bit, this little nodule bit here is right up behind the pulley. You have to sort of tuck it in underneath. I think there's a toothed wheel on the other side of this pulley, hidden from view. Okay, so when you put it in, I've tightened that up tight by hand, but not over tight. It's just a plastic housing on this. There is a metal sort of guide tube on the sensor, but I've just tightened that up firm but not over tight, and made sure that that little peg behind this hole was located. That sort of means the sensor's in the right position. So what I'm going to do now is give this all a bit of a clean, right, and try to get some down in there as well, sort of really to act as a water dispersant. I don't want too much of that oil getting on the belt, otherwise that's going to slip. Right, okay, now I wonder if it's worth spraying a little bit into there. It's not to stop corrosion, it's just to stop any water getting in there. I didn't hear that click, but well, the plug is definitely on. It's not coming off again. It's always nice when you hear it click on. Didn't hear it click, but that barbed bit is definitely down, so it's on there. It's on there. I guess the big test will be to start the engine, see if it runs. Right, okay. Hop in, let's see if this starts. Now this is going to be tricky. We are on an axle stand, that should be okay. Right, short little gear. Yeah, it runs. It runs good. Let's have a little look. What I'm going to do, that seems to be running fine. Let's just turn the engine off. And okay, so that's running with the new sensor, which is a big relief, because I have heard stories of people changing the sensor and then the car doesn't start. Not quite sure what would cause that. Maybe it's just not connected properly, the plug isn't on properly, the sensor isn't located properly, or maybe you just got a bad sensor. Never rule that out. I've known it happen. People change a part, go and buy a new part and fit that, and it's actually faulty as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is wrap some more insulation tape around this. Okay, I'm not going to start putting sealant into those holes. I don't think that's really the right thing to do. There should be some rubber sleeves down in those holes, but I just think if I try and put sealant on that now that it's all drenched in oil, that's sealant's just not going to stick. So if I wrap some tape carefully around those exposed wires, so that you can see here there is actually insulation tape comes down to about there, and then you've got bare wires. I'll continue that down and just put some kind of around the body of the sensor, not too much, but just enough to just protect that against water splashes. And then I'm going to put the wheel on, take it for a drive and see how it goes. Okay, so I've just wrapped the exposed wires and the connector with some black insulation tape. It doesn't look pretty, but it can only help keep the water away from that connector. I shall try to develop a proper splash guard at some point, but until then that will have to do. Right, let's get this wheel back on and take it for a drive. Just before I put the wheel back on, I'll just show you with this panel, before you locate these two nuts here, make sure the bottom of the panel is above this. Okay, there is actually a little sort of tongue bit here that has to locate above here. It's a bit fiddly because you've got to get this bit in there, that bit in there, and then that bit in there, and that bit in there. This is on this side of this panel, and this is on this side of this panel. It took me a couple of attempts to get that relocated in properly, and now I've put these nuts on and tighten those up. Okay, I can now refit the two screws into the bottom of this splash guard. Okay, I've just got back from a test drive and everything is working perfectly. The car feels great, nice and powerful and smooth, no lurching or coughs or splutters. That crank sensor seems to have done the trick. I do firmly believe that that was the cause of this morning's breakdown, and now that that is changed, the car is running good as gold again. Brilliant. I hope that was useful. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching. Bye.